All right, so we've got kind of a smaller group today, and so I want this discussion to be as directed towards what's meaningful for you as possible. As far as my presentation, they gave me about an hour to speak. It's really only going to take me 30 to 35. We're going to give the rest of the time back to you all for questions, Q&A. So to start, I'll introduce myself and kind of where I'm coming from. We'll go through our goals, and I'm going to break planning into a few different categories for us today. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about trusts and ABLE accounts because that's where most of the nuance is, and usually where most of our questions are. We'll talk a little bit about financial planning, and then, like I said, we'll end. I'll have a challenge for you, and we'll go into some Q&A. So I'm Nick. I'm Kirsten's husband and Everly's dad. Everly was born about a year and a half ago, so we're in that really fun phase with her, but she has an uncle named Aaron, my brother, who I'm going to tell you a lot more about. I serve at a ministry at our church. This is actually a kind of new thing that I'm really passionate about. Special needs ministry at our church that is essentially a ministry to allow families like mine, families in the special needs community, to have a place and have a home at church. And I get to interact with a lot of different kiddos with varying disabilities and varying support needs. Professionally, as they mentioned, I run Wallace Financial, and we do what we call special needs planning. So if you picture a regular financial planning practice that serves the general public, we're very specific in that we serve parents or families of children with disabilities. About 80% of the new families that we work with, month in and month out, have a child or a loved one with disabilities. Right now we're working with around 350 families in more than 20 states, and the question then comes, well, how did we get here? Or what led me to this point to where I'm here from Kentucky speaking today about a topic I'm really passionate about, what made me decide to build out my practice the way that I have. We'll get to that in a second, but first I want to say, what's our overarching mission, or what are we really here to do, Wallace Financial? And as was mentioned, our mission is to create more secure futures for individuals with disabilities and their families. And I think that "and their families" is really important, because the more secure that we are as a family, the more secure that we can be for our loved ones who need our support. Our method, how are we doing this? Well, I told you directly, the 350 or so families we work directly with as their financial advisor, but we know that we want to impact more families than we could ever work with personally. So we're on a mission just to provide mass free education. The workshop that you're attending today, we've had about 2,000 families go through, and we know that there's roughly 8 to 10 million families in the United States who have a loved one with disabilities, and we really want this message to be broadly reached. So mass free education is essentially our business model. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about our family's experience and what led us to this point. On the screen you see photos of my brother Aaron, and Aaron's brain injury was roughly 12 years ago. We're fortunate that Aaron's a really happy guy. He's smiling in all of these photos. He's really happy. I'm going to call Mom out. She's actually in the corner of the room here. So she's doing some standing therapy with Aaron. In the bottom right, we have my wedding a few years ago, and Dad's breaking it down at the reception. So Aaron's brain injury was, again, 12 years ago. And at the time this topic, special needs planning was brought up for our family, but our eyes just kind of glazed over. We were doing that ICU thing that we were just talking about in our time before. You know, we weren't ready to talk about special needs trust. We weren't ready for this information to really sink in. And I, as a sibling, especially was not ready to start talking about that. So fast forward about 7 years ago is when I started my career as a financial planner, and I started asking some questions of my mom, my dad. I said, hey, what do our plans look like for Aaron's future? And they had a financial advisor, so I assumed that meant that they were all taken care of. Really quickly, we realized that the financial advisor, great person, had him set up with some investment strategies, which was fine, but it really didn't have a plan that was specific to Aaron's needs, and there were a lot of big gaps in our planning. So that caused some anxiety for me as a new financial planner. I went through a short process of how can I learn to address my family's needs as fast as possible, and we got to that place where we could take a deep breath. We could just, okay, we've got a plan for Aaron, and that felt really good as a family. But then it dawned on me, there's probably a lot of families out there like mine who have similar questions or concerns about planning for the future of a loved one with disabilities. So that was the start of my journey. I decided to build out my practice. How can I help families overcome that same obstacle that my family had? And the start of that was identifying what's the challenge, right? So why is this financial planning thing so hard to do? Why did it take me becoming a financial advisor myself for my family to get a solid financial plan? And really I can come up with three main challenges that we had. The first is it seemed complicated. So we're going to talk about some complex stuff today. Special needs trust, government benefits, able accounts, all of those things can be really complex and overwhelming, and it can cause us to freeze up. The second is it's scary to think about, right? So pictures on the screen of all of the people that are really special in Aaron's world, all the people who rally around him and support him. When we talk about planning, we're really saying, well, how do we create a plan that supports him even if those people aren't here? And that's scary. And just the fact that we're in a room talking about this tough thing, it takes courage, right? And then lastly, we didn't know where to turn for help. So what I find is that there's not a financial advisor, there's not an attorney in every town who's really knowledgeable and passionate about this work that's easily accessible for families. So understanding that those were the challenges, I wanted to target that, and that's what we're doing today. So maybe one of these you could relate to, or maybe all three of these you could relate to. If it seems complicated, the mission today is to simplify this planning. If it's scary to think about, we're all in here together to be courageous so that we can take action. And once you get to the other end of that scary, you can have a little bit of peace knowing that you've addressed the things that concern you. And then if you don't know where to turn for help, we're an accessible resource across the U.S. However, we might not be the exact resource that you need, and we can connect you with other specific resources that can help you in this journey. So I just added this slide recently to this presentation, but it's because this word anxiety came up so much in my conversation with parents is, gosh, this topic, it just stresses me out. So I have a mantra that I've had for a long time, and we've started using it with families, is that we're most at peace while we're making progress, or another way to say it is we can't worry about something and work on it at the same time. So what I find is whenever families start to make progress, it's not that we're going to have a perfect plan tomorrow, and we shouldn't strive for perfect in the first place. But once we start working on something, we begin to feel a level of ease about that thing. All right. So that kind of sets the stage for the foundation of what we're going to talk about. Special needs planning, like I said, we're going to simplify it. And to simplify it, we got to put it into boxes or categories. So really there's three categories that we're going to talk through today: legal, financial, and family. Family could also be called care planning, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. So in this legal category, which by the way, don't feel like you have to write down everything you see on the screen because we are going to make sure you have access to the slides, but please do feel free to take notes. So in this legal planning category, the first thing we've got to talk about is government benefits, just because this is something that can be very helpful. And I know that some people have traveled today. Government benefits are different in every state that we work in. There's Medicaid and Medicaid waivers. There's SSI or Social Security. That's a rather uniform thing. And then there's additional benefits that can vary by state. We're not going to go deep into these unless we come back to them during the Q&A for the sake of time today. But the one thing to note about government benefits, we could do a whole nother workshop on government benefits. Oftentimes they come with a resource limit. And if you're not familiar with the resource limit, I hear the murmurs in the room, many of you are, but it's $2,000, which is a crazy number. If my brother Aaron has more than $2,000, then all of a sudden his Medicaid benefits and some of his other benefits are in jeopardy, right? So that's one thing we've got to just be aware of. It's one of our challenges. How can we provide for our loved one if they're only allowed to have $2,000? And we've got some tools for that we're going to talk through. The other part of legal planning is estate planning. So this includes the regular estate planning that all families should have, like a will, power of attorney, other documents that an attorney might recommend. But it also includes this other thing called a special needs trust. And there's a couple different types we're going to talk through. And then the last thing, and this is more specific to when a child turns 18 years old, but it's guardianship or alternatives to guardianship. Again, this is one we're not going to spend a ton of time on today unless we have Q&A on it. But this is just something to be on a family's radar as the child approaches 18, when legally they become an adult. And in order to help them with decision making or to give them supportive care, we need some sort of legal mechanism around that. Okay, financial planning. So this is, let me make sure I say this right. Legal planning, we do a lot of guidance for families, but because I'm not an attorney, I can't actually draft a special needs trust or an estate plan. We actually use local resources to the families that we work with. The lane that I stay in directly, what I help families is in the financial planning. So whenever I think about the conversations that I have with parents day in and day out, it really is trying to answer one of three basic questions, and there's kind of a timeline around this, right? So in the short term, the first question is, if something did happen unexpectedly, and the very rare or unlikely scenario that happens, do we have a plan in place financially, like some type of life insurance, some type of strategy that is to support the family's needs? And hopefully we can get a quick checkbox there and move on to the next question, which is retirement. So as the parents approach and enter retirement, do we have a system? Have we created a plan where they'll have income for themselves, plus any additional income they might need to support their loved one? And then lastly, and we kind of move through these in sequence, we move on to the third question, which is the long-term inheritance planning. So whenever mom and dad do live for a very long lifetime and then pass on, what's the strategy we have that's a permanent inheritance? How are we creating something that will ultimately support the child whenever they have needs beyond the parent's lifetime? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So this third category of planning, I called it family planning. I said I could also call it care planning, but this is really where the legal structure and the financial plans come together to then ultimately create the quality of life for the individual who needs it. And really there's two main pieces there. There's the person who oversees the day-to-day or medical care, and then there's the person who oversees the funds behind it. So we call it the manager of the plan. This is the day-to-day person. Sometimes it's a sibling, sometimes it's an organization, sometimes it's a family member, but who would be that person that steps in the role to provide support for our loved one? And then trustee. So this is the person who's in charge of the money inside of a special needs trust. This can be, again, it can be a person like a family member. This can also be an organization like a trust company or a nonprofit. I have a couple bullets down at the bottom. Trust protector is a third role that is basically somebody to oversee the trustee and just make sure that they're behaving properly. And then the letter of intent, we actually did a whole different workshop on this a few weeks ago, and we'll have another one that we make sure that Team Luke is aware about, and they'll make sure to pass it on. But about creating a letter of intent, and a letter of intent, just to quickly touch on this, is a handbook, right? It's a handbook for the person that you might leave in charge. So where you would write down the daily routines, what do they like, what do they dislike, medications, contact information for everybody, and just having all that filed in one place so that the next generation of support doesn't have to start from scratch in trial and error. Okay, so those are the categories, high level. We're going to dive into that legal planning category. And like I said, we're going to spend the most amount of time here just because this is usually where most of the questions are, because they've made it complex on us, to be frank. So you remember me talking about it a few minutes ago, the government benefit resource limit, that $2,000 thing, which, by the way, that number was set in like the 70s, and they haven't changed it since. They haven't even adjusted it for inflation. There's been a few passionate legislators who have tried to make it $10,000, which would at least give some breathing room and not make it such a hustle to stay under that. But that hasn't got any momentum yet. We hope that'll pass in the next few years. Anyway, we're dealing with a $2,000 resource limit. Fortunately, we have three places we can put money that does not count against the $2,000 resource limit, and that is an ABLE account and two types of special needs trusts. So an ABLE account, some of you might be familiar with what a 529 plan is. And a 529 plan is basically a tax-advantaged investment tool for a child's education. Roughly 10 years ago, the government got together and they said, you know what? we ought to give another opportunity for individuals with disabilities underneath this 529 plan, and that's where we got the 529A or the ABLE account. And that's an acronym. It just stands for Achieve a Better Living Experience, and it's a savings or an investment account to benefit an individual with disabilities. Now you might say, well, Nick, what do you mean a savings or an investment account? All that really means is the money inside of your ABLE account, you can keep it in cash that's not really getting any interest, but it's not subject to fluctuation, or you can invest it in varying investment strategies so that it will grow with interest over the long term, taking on some risk. To have an ABLE account, the diagnosis has to be prior to age 26. Fortunately, that increases to age 46 here in a few years, which is really helpful for many veterans. But some things to note. So just some numbers. The max we can put in an ABLE account is 17 grand per year. And that's from all sources. So if the child themselves from an income source that they have gifts, if they put in $10,000, you can only put in $7,000 as a gift. It's just total all in $17,000. And the most we can have in an account is $100,000. We can actually get above and beyond that, but if we go above $100,000, that's when some of those government benefits will start to look at an ABLE account as a resource. It can be used for what they call qualified disability expenses, which is a really broad category. It includes food, shelter, medical expenses, transportation, education, technology, really, really broad. As long as we're not using the money on something that doesn't directly benefit the individual with disabilities, or if the expense is strictly entertainment and doesn't have any sort of accessible or disability related aspect to it, we might not be able to spend it to that, but it's kind of a gray area, right? Really broad in what we can use this for. So the other thing to note is an ABLE account does have what's called a Medicaid estate recovery in many states. And all this means is money in an ABLE account at the time of the passing away of the individual with disabilities could be subject to Medicaid recovering those funds up to what Medicaid has spent out for them if they have Medicaid benefits. Fortunately, this is going away in many states. It's like 8 or 9 states just passed that this would go away, and usually when that happens, most of the states try to follow suit, and hopefully that does go away. Just something to be aware of in your ABLE accounts. And then lastly, your ABLE account cannot be the beneficiary of your life insurance or your investments. All that means is you can't list, whenever I pass away, I want the money to go directly into the ABLE account. We've had that question many times before, and so that's why it's a part of the slide. Okay, so you might be sitting there thinking, Nick, you said we were going to simplify planning and you just gave us 100 facts about ABLE accounts, right? And I realized that. So I think the best thing I could do, some of those things need to be said, but the best thing I could do is just back up and say, all right, all that being said, what is an ABLE account and what is it not? What are these things good for? So an ABLE account is a great short to midterm savings tool, meaning putting money into an ABLE account, allowing it to grow, with ultimately a plan that you are going to spend it on something. What it's not that long-term plan that we should just put money into indefinitely, thinking that it will someday provide for a child's lifetime. We've got different tools for that. And specifically, the reason behind that is we don't want ABLE account balances getting really, really large because there's a little bit less control, there's a little bit less protection of money inside of an ABLE account. And I'm sure that we'll come back to ABLE accounts with questions. Okay, so now we're going to start talking about special needs trusts. There's 2 different types of special needs trusts. One more common than the other, but we're going to talk about both of them because it's likely that families in this room have experience with both of these different types of special needs trusts. So the first type of special needs trust we're going to talk about is what's called a first party special needs trust. And all that term first party means is where did the money come from to fund this trust? If it's a first party trust, it came from the individual with disabilities themselves, meaning, and we actually had a first party trust for my brother Aaron. During his accident, there was an amount of insurance money that was meant to support him after that, and it belonged to him. And it was, more than $2,000, so he needed to put it somewhere quickly so that he could keep his government benefits. We had to create a first-party special needs trust for that because that money belonged already to Aaron. He couldn't gift it away. These are most common in two scenarios. The one I just described, which is like a personal injury scenario where a child receives a significant benefit, or maybe medical malpractice where the child receives a significant benefit. There's also what's called an accidental inheritance. And what this means is, like, grandma or grandpa, they didn't know that they weren't supposed to do this, but they left behind an inheritance directly to the child with disabilities. And of course, we'd like to prevent that by setting up a strategy, but if that happens and all of a sudden the child has assets, this is when we use a first-party special needs trust sometimes. Some things to note is the diagnosis must be prior to age 65. There's no maximum funding. There's no maximum total value we can have in this. There's no guideline to that. And then a first-party special needs trust does also have that Medicaid estate recovery that I just described. Again, that Medicaid, seeing those assets as belonging to the child, could recover to recoup any funds that Medicaid has paid out for the child's benefit. And that's why you heard me say we did have a first-party special needs trust for Aaron. What I mean to say is we decided to spend those monies down because we would rather strategically create a different type of fund for Aaron. Oftentimes, first-party trusts are spent first. Okay, so more commonly, families will have what's called a third-party special needs trust. It's important to get some definitions out of the way on this. First is to say, okay, now what does third party mean? We know first party means the money came from the individual with disabilities. Third party means the money came from anywhere else. So most commonly, the parents are the ones who are funding this. However, really anybody can. Aunts, uncles, close friends, grandparents, anybody can leave money behind into a third party trust. And then the second thing I think is really important to touch on is what's a trust, right? Before I started in this work, I couldn't have really clearly explained to you what exactly a trust is or how it works, what it does. So think of a trust as a container of assets or its own entity, so to speak, and it can own anything that you and I can own as an individual. So a trust can own a house, a car, a bank account, an investment account, all of those things that we as people can own. A trust can own those things, but more specifically, a trust owns those things for the benefit of the person it was set up for. And in this scenario, it's for the benefit of a person with disabilities. So then how are they used? How is a third-party special needs trust used? We know that a first party is used whenever we receive a significant amount of money and we got to put it somewhere quick. A third-party trust is used really not until the parents have passed on. So, and what I mean to say is, of the many families we work with, very few of them have a funded third-party special needs trust. Reason being, the parents are still alive. But many of the parents have an empty third-party special needs trust that's essentially waiting to someday receive an inheritance. So I'll describe our trust. Our trust is a packet of documents. It's sitting over in the corner of the house, and it's getting dusty, and hopefully it will continue to get dusty for 1,000,000 years until someday mom's ready to pass on, right? And then it gets funded. And that's usually how most of the families that we work with, their trust is set up. As far as funding, we get a lot of questions about funding it while you're alive, and there's very rare scenarios where that's beneficial. We would much rather the parents have assets in their own name, growing them with the goal of funding the trust someday. As far as what can we use a third-party trust money on, really it's meant to support a child above and beyond what government benefits provide. So if SSI is meant to provide basic food and housing, and then if Medicaid is meant to provide medical supports, third-party trust is not meant to replace those things, not meant to fund those before the government, but rather to support above and beyond those benefits. No maximum funding or total value, and then a third-party trust does not have that Medicaid estate recovery that we talked about. And you might be thinking, well, Nick, you keep talking about Medicaid estate recovery. Why is that even important? The reason is because many of the families we work with, my family included, are working really hard to save money and put money back to support their child's future, and they just want peace of mind knowing that if something were to happen, that money's protected and can either stay in the family or go to a cause that's important to them as opposed to being recovered by Medicaid. And then lastly, a third-party trust can be the beneficiary of your life insurance and your investments. So we talk with many families after our workshop here, and a lot of them are asking questions, well, how does this exactly work? in your beneficiary designation spot for your 401k or your life insurance or whatever accounts, this is where you would write in, instead of your child's name directly, you would write in special needs trust for the benefit of child, and it would just go directly to it. Okay, so same thing we did with the ABLE account, but which is saying, well, what is a third-party special needs trust and what is it not? And it's flip-flop, right? So where the ABLE account is good, the special needs trust is not, but the special needs trust is good where the ABLE account is not. And this really is that long-term plan. This is meant to be the place that we leave behind the long-term support to support a child for their lifetime. The reason for that, there's a lot more control over this type of money whenever you set it up, and a lot more protection around it. It's not a short to midterm savings tool, just like we talked about. We wouldn't put money in here that we think we're going to use in the next 5 to 10, 15 years, really as long as we're alive. So then, furthermore, about this type of special needs trust, kind of a segue into financial planning, is it's not complete unless there's a financial plan to fund it. And what I mean is, I just described our family's trust. It's this dusty pack of documents. It's going to sit there forever. Unless there's a specific strategy we have in place, unless we have a plan that's going to ultimately fund that trust, then it forever will be that empty packet of documents, right? We need a plan that's going to become the funding for this trust. Okay, so I have a slide here, and it's titled Financial Planning. And very intentionally, I did not title this slide Special Needs Financial Planning. And the reason is because there are things that all families need to think about, regardless of having a loved one with disabilities or not. All families need to think about retirement, managing debt, investment strategies, and so on and so forth. And most of the work that I do with families is in these categories of general financial planning, just having a solid plan. It's that extra thing that we families in the special needs community need to think about, and it's what I call special needs planning, mainly just because they call it a special needs trust. I think special needs planning was appropriate. And I've got an image here. It's a very basic image. You can tell I'm not a graphic designer. But what this is meant to depict is how my family's plan works today and many of the families that we work with. So today, we have Aaron, or an individual with disabilities, in the center. And how his world goes round is really two ways. First is he has government benefits that are supporting him. And of course, government benefits are lacking. They can't really give him the quality of life. And so therefore we have the family support and care, all of the people that love Aaron and rally around him to fill in the cracks and support the things that he does need. And what we're trying to accomplish through special needs planning is really to fill in that gap if some of those key members aren't there anymore. And that's what the special needs trust. That's what that's really meant to do, is help provide quality of life above and beyond what the government benefits do. So then is kind of the underlying question that we're talking about with families is, how do we actually fund that special needs trust? It's important to know that special needs trusts are really tax sensitive. They're not taxed the same way that you and I are as individuals. And so we need to be careful about leaving behind taxable monies to the trust. It's really important, if you're talking with a financial advisor, that they do understand special needs planning. Okay, so this slide is really just meant to be a checklist for the person who's going to look at these slides later and just kind of print them off and look through them. But this is really the things that my family has done and put in place to give us that level of peace of mind. Just a checklist of the things we did in the legal planning category, the financial planning, and the family planning category. And something that we go back to, too, as time goes by to make sure we're on the right track. Every family who comes to one of these workshops has the opportunity of a free consultation with myself. And so there's a QR code. I'll give a few moments so that you can scan that, and I'm going to get a drink of water here. So this link is one that's directly to my calendar, and I'll come back to this link in a moment. There's going to be another link that is a link to a survey with us. And so for a person who is not ready to schedule a phone call immediately today, but does want to be in our network, aware of all the different things we're putting on, also fill out that survey so that we can make sure that you're on our mailing list. So let's see how we are on time. I usually talk faster when it's in person.
I'm sorry, I walked in.
Okay.
Are you in Texas?
We're actually in Kentucky. I didn't share that. So we're in Kentucky. We work nationally with families across the United States. Many of them happen to be in Texas. So, yep. Kentucky, yes. Okay. So as we come to a wrap, every time I do this workshop, I always want to challenge the families who were able to join to do one of three things. And I understand that this challenge is unique today because this whole conference is going to be tons of really great info. So how can we take action on every single thing that we take in, right? So instead of leaving today's workshop with all of the knowledge that we've talked about today and feeling like we have to have a solid plan tomorrow, let's not put the pressure on ourselves to do that, right? Let's just take a baby step, and I'll challenge you to do one of three things. And I think, if I had a method of tracking families taking my challenge after the workshop, I would love to know that families are doing one of these three things. And the first one's very basic, and that's just calling a family meeting. And this applies whether you have a very advanced plan already or if you're just getting started in planning, but just having everybody sit down and say, hey, I went to this workshop and maybe you learned some new things, or maybe this is just a refresher course of things you already knew, but say, hey, we should talk about this and see if there's some area that we can make some progress on. The next thing would be scheduling an attorney consultation and talking with a special needs attorney about your specific needs as it relates to estate planning and special needs trusts. I put a star there because it's really important if you talk with an attorney that they know this stuff. It'd be very easy to find many estate planning attorneys. That's a very general thing and easy to find. A very small percentage of them actually do special needs trusts day in and day out. And unfortunately, we've seen many families pay a large fee for something that ends up needing to be replaced. So if you're not connected with an attorney who's knowledgeable, we have a network across the U.S. And if we don't already know somebody in your area, we can make that connection. And then lastly would be schedule a financial advisor consultation. This person does not have to be me, but again, I would recommend talking with somebody who's knowledgeable in special needs planning. And so this QR code is a little different than the one you just scanned. The first one was the link to my calendar where we can schedule an intro call. This QR code is the survey. So I'd love to know, how we did. Tell me how we can improve, because we do this workshop on a very regular basis, and we always want to make improvements and changes to make it more relevant. And also, it gets you on our mailing list so that we can make sure you're aware of all of our future events and the different things we talk about. Okay, and so that's the workshop flyer that we usually have whenever we're doing this via Zoom. That's all that I have. So I'm going to go into Q&A, and like I said, I wanted to give the remainder of the time back to you. So we're going to open up for questions, and we do also have some frequently asked questions we can go through, but I'm going to pause and just let everybody, I know some people are filling out the survey and that kind of thing, so feel free to ask questions. Yes, please do.
This is the first time that I hear about a first party or third party special needs trust, so now I don't know which one we open. Would we go through an attorney or a financial advisor to inquire and possibly switch it? Because one does not have the Medicaid estate recovery and one does. And just to clarify, what that means is if the individual passes, whatever's in that fund, that could possibly be totally recovered by Medicaid, right?
Up to the amount that Medicaid has spent, correct. Yep. And so again, to know the question of was it a first party or was it a third party, it would all be about if there's money in it now, where did the money come from? Did the money come from assets that did belong to the child with disabilities, or did the money come from assets from the parents or somewhere else?
Okay.
Or if there's no assets in it yet, it's very likely that it's a third-party special needs trust. That's so to answer your question directly, I could speak conceptually with you about that. However, if you want somebody to read it and to give you the attorney's opinion, where I could say I'm 95% sure it's this, an attorney would give you that 100% clarity. Yeah. Great question. Thanks for asking.
What's
Yes,
the
please.
part of the special needs versus just like a regular trust, education trust you set up for your kids, or like you were saying, my house is owned by a trust. Like, what designates a special needs?
Yes, great question. Let's see. So the really important thing, most trusts have the health maintenance and support language in them, and whenever Medicaid looks at that language, they say, well, this is an asset that is available to the child with disabilities. SSI does the same thing. So again, if there's an asset that is available to the child with disabilities with some discretion there, above $2,000, they're going to count that as a resource, and they're not going to approve benefits. So the short way of saying that is, if it's not a special needs trust with a very specific language, then it will count as a resource, and the child could be disqualified from government benefits until that resource is taken care of. Now, not to go too deep into the weeds here, but just because it's on my mind, a lot of times families will set up what's called a family trust or a revocable living trust that they put their house inside of and that type of thing. And you can set a special needs trust as a sub-trust under that, to where, like, my house is inside my living trust. When I pass, I want it to automatically flow to a special needs trust. That is a common way of doing it, and it skips probate, and there's some neat things about that. But it really is important that that special needs trust language exists.
Can they have both, or no? Because the regular trust would trump it's going to have more money, would trump it, right? So you would...
Yes. The question is, and maybe I should repeat back because we're being recorded. The question is, can a child have a regular trust and a special needs trust? The thing is, we're really just looking at that $2,000 resource limit thing. If that wasn't an issue, then we wouldn't have to do all this complex stuff. But if there is in excess of $2,000 in anywhere other than an ABLE account, a first-party trust, or a third-party trust, and it's in the child's name or a trust for the child, then it could count as a resource, and it could disqualify them from government benefits. Yeah, great questions. Yes, please.
For the special needs trust, once you have the trustees, let's say or the successor trustee surpasses, and we have a special needs, and there's no other trustee that was appointed by the parents, what happens to that special needs trust?
Yeah. Great question. So it was asked, we have a special needs trust, we have a trustee, successor trustee, a list of trustees. What happens if we run out of the list of successor trustees? We always tell families it's really important to have an organization somewhere in that list. And also you can create language that's ambiguous about the organization. So this question kind of sparks my passion. I've been doing this work for 7 years now, and something I've recently become really passionate about is this planning is hard. We started the workshop talking about it. Like, this planning is hard. It's hard to wrap our mind around creating a trust. And one thing I find is really hard is we go into an attorney's office and they tell us, hey, who's going to be this person, and this person. And the conversation is so driven on what if something happens tomorrow. And that's important. That's an important thing to address, right? But it's very unlikely that something's going to happen tomorrow. So yes, let's address those questions. Let's ask ourselves the question, who is the trustee of our special needs trust 40 years from now? We can't come up with an answer for that. We could choose the best organization, like the best trust company today, and they might not be the best trust company 40 years from now. So we always instruct our families or guide our families to be very flexible in the way that they set up their trust. And we even sit in on some attorney meetings to make sure that, because attorneys are very well-meaning but they want to address the question, we can leave it ambiguous in the trust. We can say upon which point that a trustee is needed, and if this successor trustee, then XYZ person, family member, is to find the best trust company at that point in time. We can have that language set in place. And that's actually where, if I go back to this trust protector, I don't think my laser, I think it was actually going to ricochet, so I'm glad that I didn't point anybody in the eye. The trust protector role here is really important. Being a trustee of a special needs trust is a lot. It's almost like a part-time CPA job that we might not want to wish that on our family members. We might not want them to have to do that. But the other thing we don't want to do is just give all the power to an organization. Like, how can we trust that? Even though I give everybody the benefit of the doubt, we don't want to just pass away the reins totally. So we can set it up in kind of a way that addresses both of those issues through having what's called a trust protector. The trust protector can hire and fire a trustee, which is not a very hard job. It's basically just overseeing things, and unfortunately it hardly ever has to happen, because if the trustee knows that they can be fired, they behave much better, right? So then back to my whole who's the trustee 40 years from now question. Hard question to answer. Easier question to answer. Who's a family member that we can trust, or some succession list of family members we can trust to make the right decisions over the long term? We can probably come up with an answer to that question. And that's how we instruct our families to set up special needs trusts. So you asked a question that probably could have taken 2 sentences to answer, and I rambled.
I appreciate the detailed answer.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I know you said you didn't want to go in the weeds on that, but what made you choose guardianship over guardianship advocate?
For Aaron.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. So the question was, whenever our child or our loved one turns 18, we have to face the issue of now they're a legal adult, and legally our system is to where, the doctors could deny us access to their records. The bank could deny us access to their bank account if we're not a cosigner on that. We have to address that somehow. And this is one where the laws vary state to state. Sometimes it even varies in the counties. Judges aren't very educated on how it works. It's a broken system, really, and we have to navigate it. But we have guardianship, and we also have alternatives to guardianship. For us, we chose guardianship for Aaron, and the reason is because in our experience with Aaron's brain injury, it's the things that guardianship limits, so his right to vote or marry, those types of things. We don't see that necessarily as something that's very limiting for him based on his level of ability right now. And so getting the protection out of guardianship is we could benefit from that. Many of the families we work with want their child to retain those rights, and so we look at alternatives that are less restrictive, less protecting, but also more open with how it works. And so that's one where we always connect with a local attorney who is knowledgeable in guardianship. And we encourage families, especially families with younger children, not to stress about this until we get closer. Why? Guardianship laws will change. Our child's future, our child's abilities will change, right? And I say this all the time, like we're having this conversation now. If we had this conversation 10 years from now, it could look totally differently. So there's no reason to make long-term decisions or stress over long-term decisions. We encourage families to start thinking about this between the child's age 16 and 18.
So our son just turned 18, so we're working on trying to figure out what's the best option for that. If we're leaning for the full guardianship at that point. If his abilities change, is it easy to get to the alternatives? Because that's the question that I'm kind of battling right now.
Good question. And this is one of those, we work really closely with attorneys in many states. I can only give you a 95% sure answer. I have to put that asterisk, on my answers. So from my experience, it's really hard to undo guardianships once we've done them. Whereas if we started with something less intrusive, it's easier to ramp it up to a guardianship. And so it sounds like you're in the process of evaluating, well, here's the pros and cons of each option. So, and do you have somebody, an attorney that
so
you
we
trust?
have an attorney, and so we've kind of elected the guardianship so far based on same thing. We want to have more of the control of the decision making and not give that to somebody else that doesn't know my son.
Mm-hmm.
And so the alternatives kind of leaves us with a little bit of open and ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
Also, some of the alternatives in our state does not allow for alternative therapies like we have here. So we went with the guardianship because of that.
That makes sense.
And so, and I think everybody here knows that at some point our child are going to evolve and change.
Right.
For the better, and that's kind of where I want to make sure that I have a leeway to let him get back some of his rights.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense, yeah, and that's the challenge, and that's where it's a tough decision. It is, yeah.
Okay.
I think we had a question in the back there.
No, it was just in regards to that, because that's my husband.
Oh.
On the weeds of that, and the attorney that we hired couldn't answer one question. We had so many, because my understanding is in certain states, if you're a guardian, you cannot get paid to care for your child, and there's so many benefits
Right.
that as families can benefit from. So we opted, because the attorney couldn't tell us if Florida was one, so we opted to have just one parent as a guardian, so we can have that flexibility. The other thing I found out about guardianship and the advocate guardian, and I don't know if you can confirm this, because the internet can take you into so many articles that you don't know where you're going. as a advocate, you are more restricted if you wanna take your child for some kind of research therapy or research treatment versus a guardian, you have more ability or authority to do that.
Yeah. It's one of those things that's so inconsistent. Like, unfortunately, it doesn't surprise me that the attorney was unable to answer this. I can share my family's personal experience. We were advised by our attorney to have me as what's called a standby guardian, just so that I didn't have to go through a local court process if something did happen to my parents. So we go to the judge and we ask, hey, we're here to get a standby guardian. And the judge looks us in the face and says, I've never heard of a standby guardian, but I can make you a co-guardian today. And because of that, I'm a co-guardian of Aaron, and that was never by design. It was just because of the person didn't know what we were talking about, and it's because they deal with this so infrequently. Now, fortunately, that hasn't caused much headache. You know, we signed some papers and that kind of thing so far, but
How many co-guardians can you have?
well, there's 3 right now. So yeah, so mom, dad, and I. So that's one of those things. The system I wish was better.
Yeah, I think it's left very vague, very, like you said, some judges don't know. It varies county to county.
Right.
And for us, we live in one county, but he gets treated in a different county.
Yeah.
So it's very ambiguous, and so that's kind of where, you know, for some of the parents that are doing that, I know you don't want to stress on that now, but when it gets to 16, you want to start looking at that for each state because it's very different.
Yes, I agree. Yes, please.
So I guess it's kind of like going, I know you say the co-parenting or whatever, but our worry, I guess, is, I mean, are we gonna live long enough to, you know, so, I mean, I guess we never really thought about it, but we knew that when he was getting closer to 18, maybe we need to opt for the guardianship. But that's what I'm saying, like, if tomorrow I have a car accident and I die, like, okay, like, it does, I guess it goes with what you just answered, but that's what it is. So you can have as many as you want to, because I mean, I don't know if my kid's gonna be alive. So do you just go and put like, I mean, I have 5 kids, so.
Yeah.
I mean, I want all of them to, you know, they're close enough, they care for their brother, but I mean, I'm saying 40 years from now, if I'm not alive, I mean,
Yeah.
Are you able to do something like that?
So this is one
I guess.
I would recommend addressing with an estate planning attorney. I know that it's a little bit easier to address through a will if a child is under the age of 18. After the child is 18, that's when we have to be more specific. But this is where that letter of intent at the bottom comes in. Is from a legal perspective, there's only so much we can do, but keeping well documented what our wishes are, keeping well documented what our child's needs are, keeping well documented all of these things. And this is one where, you know, building community is the theme of this week, but I think this whole topic, the special needs planning thing we're talking about today, it's so important to have a team of people and to slowly accumulate people that you trust on this team, because that document, this letter of intent that I'm referring to, is something that a therapist should have a copy of. The teacher that you really connect with and trust, they should have a copy of. Your financial planner should have a copy of. Just because having that clearly communicated needs of the child is really important. So, hey.
Okay, is it common to see a family have all 3 accounts, like to have an able, have a first party and a third party?
Yeah, great question. I would say it's uncommon, but the only reason that it's uncommon is just because many of the families we work with don't have all 3 of those needs simultaneously. But there is a situation where you have all 3, you could benefit from all 3.
So if you have, like, let's say, you know, the able account's more short term because you're just starting and you're just like, my kid's younger, blah, blah, blah. What would you do? Like spend, like you said, you kind of spent all from the first?
Yeah.
Can you, like, transfer it, or can you, how does that work?
Yeah, great question. So in the scenario that a child has kind of a setup where they've got multiple of these items, we would recommend spending the first party special needs trust first. Not frivolously, like not just for the purpose of spending it, but for the purpose of if spending money out of this first party special needs trust on qualified expenses does relieve a financial burden for the family, then the family can in turn reposition assets that might be third party trust assets or able account assets that might be more advantageous. So the answer is yes, and I guess maybe a blanket answer would be having strategy around it's always a good thing. Yeah, great question.
Are you taxed if you take the money out
Great question. So a little bit differently across the three. ABLE accounts are, fortunately, they're tax-free, so we get to put money in and grow on a tax-advantaged basis. Furthermore, some states will give you a tax deduction for putting money in it, so that's kind of cool. First party and third party special needs trusts, they have their own tax return. So think about it this way. A trust has an investment account inside of it. Hopefully that investment account gets some interest. It's going to receive a tax return, almost like it's a person that has an investment fund that gets interest. So working with a CPA on exactly how those taxes need to be filed, because there's ways around some traps that can happen inside of a special needs trust.
And just to clarify for the trust, that would only be once it's funded.
Correct, yes. And I'm glad you pointed that out, because a lot of families, this is something that's just come up in topic a lot recently, is like, well, attorneys, how much does it cost to have a trust, all those things. Working with an attorney is and should be transactional when it comes to setting up an estate plan, meaning you go to the attorney's office, you pay them a fee, and they give you a finished product, which is a special needs trust. There's no ongoing, and there shouldn't be an ongoing, paying them ongoing for them to service that. And then furthermore, the trust then just sits as this empty container and doesn't have any cost associated with it until it's funded. Once it's funded, the cost would be if we do have a trustee. If there is a trustee we're paying, is what I mean to say. And let's see, did I answer that question fully? I think so.
Taxes, yeah, so the taxes that you were talking about having its own tax return, that only happens.
Yeah, only if there's money inside of it, only if it's
money would go towards keeping it.
correct. So then more specifically, we would much prefer parents have assets in their own name that they're building that will be left behind in a tax advantaged manner to a special needs trust to limit the tax burden on that trust once it's funded. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
So if your child gets, let's say, like a settlement or medical something, or like you said, those big lump sums, and they still have lots of needs, you're still doing lots of stuff for them, you're remodeling your house, you're doing all things, right?
Yes.
A first party would be the way to go.
Yeah, if it's $17,000 or less, we put it in an ABLE account, and maybe even we just carve off the first 17 grand, put it in the ABLE account.
And you can split it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. We don't want the ABLE account to go above and beyond the 100,000. So again, it's not that long-term thing, but almost 100% of the families that we work with that did or will receive a settlement as a relate of some type of injury or accidental inheritance that does end up going to a first-party trust, just because it's kind of the default option.
And that can be like huge,
It-
millions.
it can
so it's
be.
like you're looking at that, you're like, oh man, what are you gonna do? So then, let's say 40 years went by, you're older. Could you take money from there because you're and put it in a third party?
Not necessarily, but in a roundabout way, possibly. Again, if we can spend money from the first party trust in ways that, within the guidelines of what first party trust can be spent on, in a way that relieves financial burden on the parents, then the parents can then use that. The other thing to note, and I'm glad you brought that up, is sometimes in this first party trust scenario where there is a significant first party trust, we might start to look at that as the long-term plan and not put pressure on the family to fund if we already have a funded first-party trust that could provide for the child's lifetime, we might not feel as much financial need to build a third-party trust because that long-term plan already could exist through that first-party trust.
This might seem like a silly question, but my family is originally from Ghana. So my husband and I have property in Ghana. We have property here as well. So if we wanted to set up, say, a third-party trust for our daughter, can we put assets that are overseas in the trust as well?
Great question. So the question was about international assets, and we actually work with many immigrant families. And from my understanding, the answer is no, we can't put foreign assets into a local trust. And oftentimes, if we're trying to include international assets in the estate planning, we have to work with an attorney local to the asset who understands the law local to the asset. So, in the rare case, we'll have a United States-based attorney communicating with a international attorney to see if there's any way that they might work together, if there's any common ground in the laws.
Okay.
Great question. Thank you.
So just for hypothetical, right, like she was saying, there's a significant amount of money in the first party, and it's $17,000 a year. Can you fund it every year 17, 17, 17, 17 to the able account till it gets to 100,000. And then when you get there, kind of shift that over to the third party's needs trust. So kind of like filtering from one, then siphoning to the other.
Great question. So this is one we've seen it set up to where that can happen before to the able account. The one thing to note is these two, able account and first party trust monies, are what we call first party monies. All that means is they technically do belong to the child with disabilities. Those type of monies can never flow into a third party trust directly, because that mixes them, and we don't want to ever give Medicaid the argument that the assets somehow are Medicaid recoverable type monies. Great question.
To add to that, I think what I understood, just to make sure I understood, you would rather, the recommendation is not to fund the able account up to 100,000 because of the laws that they can recover those funds from those accounts. So best to put it in an account that we have personally that's gonna go to the trust when we pass.
Yes, and it all comes back to what's the goal. I'll say a very common goal, or maybe the most common goal in working with families is, how do I provide for my child if I'm not here? And because that is the most common goal, most frequently we'd rather that, what you just said, which is build up assets in the parent's name that gets left behind to a third party trust, that takes priority over the able account a lot of times. Now that's not to say an able account isn't a good tool, because it's a very good tool. It's a great tool for if we want to build up monies and someday buy a van, or if we want to build up monies and someday buy a chair, some like great equipment, or if the child is receiving a gift every Christmas and, oh my gosh, we've got this $2,000 resource limit, stop giving us Christmas gifts, but they keep giving us Christmas gifts, so we got to put it somewhere. This is where the able account comes in. We have that conversation a lot with families. Or fundraisers, the SSI money comes in and we do the rent reimbursement thing that we're advised to do, but then there's extra monies and it goes above the 2,000. Able account is great for those personal assets, but ultimately long term we want money to be going to a special needs trust. And I was just given the wave for time, so maybe we've got time for one more question, but that's all that I have. And please do fill out the survey we have at the end, so that way.
Like the difference between state to state and like things on, I mean, the trust, I know Medicaid is different, the waivers are different state to state, but how much of this transfers over that, like until you get into the specifics of where you live? This is kind of this is all general, right?
This is very general information.
Trust, like you can have it wherever you live, right?
Yes.
In the states. But then you start to get into specifics just in terms of Medicaid and those types of things, right?
Yeah, and would it be fair to say, or to restate the question just to make sure I understand, is how much of this is general U.S., all U.S. stuff, and how much of this is state-specific stuff? Is that, okay. So the thing that's state-specific is the government benefits. That's one that you pointed out. Also, because attorneys are usually locally licensed, they're not licensed across the U.S. I wish we had one wonderful attorney that was licensed all across the U.S. We usually have to work with a local attorney. That's state-specific. Guardianship is state-specific. Most other things are, across the United States. So the financial planning that we do, while it takes into account a lot of the local information, it can happen on a national basis. And I think I should just say everything else is.
I know you gotta go, but quick question. What happens if you move from state to state? Or like if I move from state to state, or I pass, but the people that are taking care of them are now in a different state? Does all of that have to be redone?
Great question. Sometimes nothing happens, meaning sometimes the planning does not need to be adjusted, but all the time it's a fair thing to get boots on the ground resource when it comes to an attorney. And that just means establish a relationship with a local attorney who can look through your stuff. We always want somebody to have, a professional to have eyes on what we've created, somebody that we trust, just so that there's no pitfalls, so to speak. Yeah, great question. And thank you all so much. Yep.
Thank you.